Good morning. It is really great to be here and to see so many new faces and some familiar faces. That's always very comforting for a new organizational leader to see such a great mix of old and new friends. My name is Felicia Wong, and I'm the president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute. It is my very great pleasure in my first public appearance with the Institute to welcome you to the kickoff conference for Rediscovering Government. Thanks to the generosity of Bernard Schwartz, a terrific partnership with the New School, and the support of many others, Rediscovering Government will be a flagship effort of the Roosevelt Institute for many, many years. As Jeff Madrick, where's Jeff? As Jeff Madrick, the initiative's director, and those of you who have heard me for many years on this topic know, I believe that the issue of government is a foundational one for progressives. For more than 30 years, we have ceded to the conservative right the idea that government is bad. We must absolutely change the civic conversation and own the idea that government is necessary for a stronger America. My own deep belief in the importance of government comes from many places, not least of which is my family. Take my dad. He was born in a one-room shack in Augusta, Georgia, 1 year after my grandparents immigrated from Guangzhou, China. As an infant, he slept in a salmon crate instead of a crib. But he went to public schools and he ultimately graduated from UC Berkeley thanks to Governor Pat Brown and the California Master Plan. Thanks to a government grant, he got a PhD from Stanford and enjoyed a 30-year career as an electrical engineer, working primarily as a government contractor. So he raised a family in the suburbs, and we were all middle class because the government structured the opportunities within which my family could strive and succeed. So my dad is just one reason that I'm very enthusiastic about our work here today. The Rediscovering Government initiative embodies the Roosevelt Institute mission. We are creating a new deal for the 21st century. We're doing this by taking on bold ideas that have leverage because they get to the root of our basic political and economic beliefs and understandings. And we are asking fundamental questions like, given the rapid changes of the 21st century, how should an active government support a vibrant American economy and politics? Or a related question, how can we ensure that the 21st century economy, the economy of 2050, is growing and that the fruits of that growth are equitably distributed to our nation's citizens? Or how can we create a politics where citizens have voice and can participate fully? As we develop the answers to these questions and drive these conversations, we will push beyond the narrow parameters of today's political debate. Our job at Roosevelt and our job in this room is to make those ideas real, getting them up and out and into the world through publications like The Nation. Thank you, Katrina, for the wonderful Nation special issue that you see on your chairs. Through publications like The Nation's, through partnerships, through work with the students in our own 10,000 strong campus network, and through vigorous conversations like the one we're going to have today. I do not know where today's conversation is going to end up. I am sure that all of us have slightly different versions of the kind of government that we'd like to see to support and drive economic growth, civic participation, and the common good. But if we're successful, today's conversation will be just the beginning. We will know that we've made a real difference when on Fox News, as well as on MSNBC, on the Wall Street Journal editorial page, as well as in the New York Times, in town halls and at dinner tables and at water coolers across the country, Americans talk openly about government. I don't think that these conversations are going to be reverential about government, and I don't think that they should be. But I do hope that they will be respectful. And I do hope that they will be animated by a curiosity to understand the ways in which government, working together with the nonprofit sector and the private sector, can shape an environment in which every American can live a better life. That's what Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt did. Shape a world so that Americans could, in difficult times, live better lives. Today, together, we can follow in our footsteps and help do the same. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Madrick. Before I begin with a few remarks, and thank you, Felicia, of course, for all your support and your fine remarks, I just wanted to ask a representative of the New School, Rick McGhee, who's a faculty member and part of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis, to give a few comments of welcome. Because of travel commitments, the president could be here, and even the chairperson of SEPA couldn't be here, but she will be here later, Teresa Ghilarducci. So Rick, a couple of brief welcoming comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Rick McGhee. I'm a faculty fellow at SEPA here at the New School, as Jeff said. And on behalf of President Van Zandt and Teresa Ghilarducci, who is, for those of you that travel and know our infrastructure problems, fighting her way back to New York, she will be here this afternoon. And the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis, I'm pleased to welcome you to this, on the New School's behalf, this important and timely conference. The Schwartz Center is dedicated to applying rigorous economic analysis to critical social and policy problems which require an active and committed government, so this conference couldn't be more timely. I was privileged to spend some time in Washington working as economic policy advisor to Senator Edward Kennedy, a great champion of using government to improve the well-being of all, who, especially for the poor and marginalized, and who understood that an active, smart, strong government is essential for operating a modern economy. So this conference is right in that spirit. I want to give special thanks to Bernard Schwartz, whose generosity and vision to support the Schwartz Center and a great deal of other work in this field. It's his intellectual leadership and commitment, really, that makes our work possible. So a special thanks to him, and welcome to all of you on behalf of the New School. And now back to the organizer of our conference, Jeff.
Thanks very much, Rick, and thanks to the New School. While we're doing our thanks, again, thanks to Felicia for all the support, and Roosevelt, Hillary Doe, Madeline Ehrlich, and Bernard Schwartz for being such a great benefactor to us. I'm very excited about this project. Excitement is not quite the right word. Probably emotion is the word, because ever since I got out of school in the 1970s, it seemed to me America was turning against government for traditional answers to social problems and even economic prosperity. In my view, it began back then for a variety of reasons, and we're going to have a panel to discuss why matters turned, and I think there'll be different opinions. There are no unicausal answers in America, but it seems to me, when I look back, our deepest problems today, and especially our lack of preparedness for going forward in this century of intense globalization and change, is our lost faith in government that began 40 years ago. Many of you are not yet 40 years old and know no other experience. When I was a kid, I actually believed in government. I believed in Medicare. I believed in the Great Society. I believed in all kinds of things that many people now turn their noses up at. The purpose of this project, which I unambitiously hope will be permanent, let me repeat that, permanent, even though not all of us will be permanent, is to provide a counter-narrative to what I think has become an anti-government ideology in America, not only in states and regions where we would expect such an ideology, but one that swept across what we used to think of as the middle of the road and even the left in America, and the media as well, which take for granted a kind of anti-government ideology. We are not going to tell people what to think, however, in this program. We're going to provide public forums. That will be a main objective of our program, public forums like this one, and smaller ones. We will take them on the road. They will be open discussions. They will provide a pursuit of knowledge. But the idea will be to talk constructively about government, not to get, the best we get today is to talk about how to get more out of less government. It will be a project that looks squarely at the constructive role of government throughout our history. In fact, I must say this, I dislike intensely the language we use, and it defines the nature of the debate. I don't like to say the role of government. Immediately, that implies a limitation, just like I don't like to say the role of parents in children's lives, or the role of children in parents' lives. There is no economy without government. There is no America without government. Government doesn't have a role. It is integral. It's a misuse of language, and it's a biased misuse of language. What we're going to do at Roosevelt, as I say, is have constant public forums. Indeed, we have another one, a smaller one, planned for Washington in early June about government and economic growth. We have a new active website that's going up today that I hope will be a repository of information and discourse on this subject that will be consulted constantly. We're going to have a library in that, a library of resources. We're going to have in that website, we're going to have a constant discussion about what you should be reading today that pertains to these issues. And we're going to do some publications and some research. We're going to try to be a constant presence in American life. I don't know any other way to do it. And I joke a little bit about permanence, but what will make this successful is if we can keep it going. Again, as I said, we are not looking to tell people what to think about government. We are looking for a wholesome public discussion. I think the nation has been barren of that kind of discussion for 30 or 40 years. I hope this is the beginning. I'm very excited about this conference. We have very interesting people with different points of view, many of which you do not hear inside the Beltway. In fact, this is a decidedly non-inside the Beltway conference, an attempt to get away from policy wonkism and to develop larger perspectives and bring up and bring out other ways of thinking about the problem, historical, empirical, theoretical, and so forth. I have some more opportunity to talk later, so I will do that later. But let me, at the moment, introduce the introducer of Joe Stiglitz. Despite having impeccable parental credentials, the woman I am about to introduce did very well in this world anyway, making her own major contributions. She is, in short, the dedicated, insightful, committed leader and chairperson of the Franklin and Eleanor Institute, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt. Thank you for everything, Anna, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate your leadership of this initiative. Thank you to all of you for being here today. This is an important challenge as we seek together to rediscover the value and the purpose of government. Perhaps because I was raised this way, but more poignantly for me because I am worried about the world my baby granddaughters are going to grow into. I take this charge as strongly as my grandparents did. I believe, as they did, that government is a good thing, that we make it ourselves. It is not an alien power over us. I believe strongly that we need conversations, as Felicia mentioned, at the dinner table, in the grocery line, when we're playing poker with our friends on a Friday night. We need to be talking about government as something we do. We need to, together, counter the concerted and relentless attack on the substantive legacy of my grandparents. I think there's no better way to start this conversation than to hear from our own chief economist and senior fellow, Joe Stiglitz. Joe brings a unique perspective to this debate. He has served as head of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors, and he is a distinguished scholar and Nobel laureate. He truly understands how government can make our economy stronger in both good times and bad. So without any further ado, Joe.
Well, thank you very much, Anna, and thank you, Jeff and Felicia. It's very exciting to be part of this discussion. In a way, I should say that this is really a discussion not just about government, but of our society and the direction our society is going. But I'm going to focus most of my remarks about government itself. A central tenet of my own work has been on the need to have a balance between government, markets, and civil society, and that every successful society achieves that balance, and that we've lost that balance, and it is important for us to try to restore that. And I'll try to spend most of my time in a more analytic framework of what are the fundamental arguments that economic theory gives for government to play a central part in our economy and our society. But first, I want to just highlight the fact that in many respects, our economy, our society is not functioning well. You know, we like to think of the great successes of the United States and of our economy, and we talk about it in terms of GDP per capita, and apart from the little bit of bump that we had in 2008, where things didn't go quite as well as they were supposed to, GDP per capita was going up. But I chaired an International Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. And one of the important conclusions of that commission was that GDP per capita was not a good measure of performance. While the US GDP per capita was going up, it wasn't sustainable. But more than that, most of the benefits of that growth were not widely shared. And if you're going to be judging how well an economy is doing, clearly I think the key metric that one wants to focus on is what's happening to the living standards of most citizens. Not what's happening to the top 1% or even the top 1/10 of 1%, but what's happening to most citizens. And I don't think most Americans realize that in terms of that criteria, we aren't doing very well. The wages, the median wage, that means median income of a full-time male worker, half above, half below, today is the same as it was in 1968, almost a half century ago. We've had, in effect, stagnation. We were talking with Jeff before the meeting, and he pointed out that, in fact, since such a large number of males now can't get a full-time job, if you include the fact that many of them are part-time workers, the median income has actually gone down by about 16%. That's really striking. If you look at median household income, it's the same today as it was a decade and a half ago. But that income has only been sustained because people are working so much longer. The number of hours worked in a household, including the fact that women are working more, has actually gone up. So while productivity has been going up, and you would have thought we would have taken some of that productivity in the form of more leisure, in terms of the household work, it's actually gone up. So in one way or another, I think we have to conclude that whatever our system is, this new system of government and market hasn't been working the way it should. And one of the reasons for that failure, I think, is the failure to allow the government to do what it needs to do to have success. Well, let me turn to what economics says about why we need government. The basic idea here goes back to Adam Smith, where the notion as it's normally articulated was that the pursuit of self-interest leads as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. He enunciated that kind of idea in 1776. It took the economics profession a long time to understand fully the conditions under which it was true. And it should be clear that not even Adam Smith really believed it. If you look at his broader writings, he pointed out that businessmen seldom get together without conspiring to have a monopoly. He talked about the role of government in education and a whole variety of areas. But most of that has been forgotten by the devotees of so-called free markets. And they believe that unbridled markets led to economic success. Well, I don't think in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, anybody believes that the unbridled pursuit of self-interest by the bankers, which is another name for greed, has led to the well-being of our economy or the global economy. And research over the last 40 years has tried to understand why markets often don't work. And that's a concept that we call market failure. And we don't mean that markets completely collapse, but that they don't produce the kind of efficient outcomes that Adam Smith talked about. And the basic idea is that in a whole variety of contexts, social returns and private rewards are not well aligned. The two are different. And we've tried to understand why those two are different. But some obvious examples, monopoly is one example, corporate governance, where those in the corporations get to shape their incentive structures, and the incentive structures are not those that are aligned with even the interest of the company, let alone the broader interest of society. A very general result that I did with a theorem that with my colleague at Columbia, Bruce Greenwald, which I sometimes summarize by saying, what we explained was that the reason the invisible hand often was invisible was that it wasn't there. And what we showed was that whenever information was imperfect, asymmetric, which is always, or where there are missing markets, markets for risk, markets for capital markets, which is always, markets are not in general efficient. And there's always a possibility of government intervention that would make everybody in our society better off. So today, there is no intellectual presumption that markets are efficient. And it's, to me, striking that in spite of the fact that there is no intellectual basis for the, you might call Smithian view that unfettered markets lead to efficiency, they've marched ahead. The right, the conservatives have marched ahead, reasserting these ideas about efficient markets that have been, in the economics literature, totally discredited. When new ideas come out, they always get challenged, and there's always a period of uncertainty that you don't know. Did you make an assumption that you wasn't clear when Adam Smith put forward his ideas? It wasn't clear what were all the assumptions that went into his conclusion that markets worked well. But it's been 3 decades since Bruce Greenwald and I put forward our analysis of why markets with economies in which there's imperfect information, as I say, which is always, or missing markets, which is always. Was there anything wrong with our analysis? And a lot of people on the right didn't like our paper when it came out. And you could see people sort of feeling very uncomfortable. But in 3 decades, no one has found anything wrong with analysis. And that leads me to suspect that it's actually right. And that means, of course, that we really ought to reframe the way we think about when markets work and when they don't. So let me very briefly try to describe how we see today some of what I was going to say the role of government, but I've been restrained by Jeff from using that word, and it's really making it difficult for me to give this talk. But and if you'll let me use this inappropriate word, but there are a number of things the government should do. One of the things is restraining markets, restraining the excessive risk-taking, the kinds of bad behavior, the monopoly power, the kinds of things where markets don't work the way they're supposed to. One of the really interesting projects that the Roosevelt Institute had a couple years ago was one which said, making markets work like markets. It seemed like, not a revolutionary idea to making markets work like markets, but it's striking how strong people in the markets don't want markets to act like markets. They don't want transparency. They don't want competition. And we tried in this Roosevelt program to highlight the ways in which markets were not working like markets and how we could make markets work like they were supposed to work. So that's one set of examples. A second one is there are a whole variety of instances where markets don't exist, where you can't buy insurance for things that are really important. Before Social Security, most people could not get annuities. And even today, you can't buy an annuity like Social Security that protects you against inflation, that protects you against some of the kinds of market vicissitudes that people, if we had privatized insurance as President Bush had wanted, you can imagine what would have happened to our elderly in the crisis of 2008. Not only is it the case that quite often people do things that they shouldn't, incentives are misaligned in a negative way, people pollute too much, there are also positive externalities. Sometimes markets do too little of certain things. So while we often talk about a restraining role, stopping people from, as I say, from excluding too much, there's also a positive role. That positive role includes, for instance, the provision of infrastructure. Felicia talked about the role of public education. The private schools don't give opportunity. One of the striking things that I bring out in this a book that's coming out in May called The Price of Inequality, that most Americans don't realize that we are no longer the country of opportunity that we think of ourselves. That America today has less opportunity, less equality of opportunity than any of the other advanced industrial countries. And this is a striking change from the way things were 30, 40, 50 years ago, and it's certainly a very big change from the way we see ourselves. We think of our Horatio Alger stories, people working hard. And there are always instances of that, but this data show that that's not a good description of America today. So those are some of the roles that government plays, but government has played an important catalytic role in a whole variety of other areas. If you think about our modern economy, you think about the internet, you think about biotech, you think about telecommunications. And all of these things rest on government-funded basic research. The internet was funded by the government. Even the first browser was funded by the government. But the history of this goes way back to the 19th century. The big revolution in the 19th century was the increase in productivity in agriculture, which began as a result of the research supported by the US government as part of the land-grant colleges, which were celebrating, will soon be celebrating the 150th anniversary of the establishment of these land-grant colleges and universities that have really transformed our country. But even the first telegraph line, the telecommunications industry, began with government support. So this is not a new idea. This is not a revolutionary idea. It had nothing to do with, you might say, socialism, Marxian economics. It was an aspect of pragmatic America. Before we developed these ideas that economists have about market failures, people understood that markets weren't working, and they strove to figure out what was wrong. And now we understand, have an analytic framework to understand why these markets don't work. We talked about positive and negative externalities, and we have a framework for doing it. But not even Adam Smith, not even any of the advocates of free markets ever claimed more for markets than that they were efficient. Nobody ever said that they were fair, that they would lead to, say, a distribution of income that was socially acceptable. And there was always a recognition that there was a need for government in addressing problems of inequality. We could have, market could lead to outcomes in which large fractions of the population were barely surviving the subsistence level. And we've always recognized this important role. And today that's manifested not only in programs for redistribution, programs on education, but also programs in social protection. And we ought to realize that there's really a lot of interaction. Many of the aspects of our inequality are a result of market failure. People who don't have health insurance, when they get sick, wind up in extreme poverty. And they can't get health insurance because of a whole set of market failures that we now understand a great deal better about. Finally, I focused mainly on you might call it microeconomics. I focused on inequality. The third important market failure that was evident so strongly at the time that President Roosevelt was the president was the economy often doesn't produce full employment. At that time, 1 out of 4 Americans couldn't get a job. The unemployment rate was 25%. But what people don't realize about today is that we're not quite that bad, but we're not in great shape. Almost 1 out of 6 Americans who would like a full-time job today can't get that full-time job. Markets do not on their own produce full employment. And even those on the right recognize that there is a need for government to maintain the economy at full employment through macroeconomic policy. So this is just a very brief list of instances of important categories in which markets don't lead to outcomes that are acceptable, that should be socially acceptable. Now, when markets don't work, it's very clear that there's a need for collective action. These are things that we have to do as a community together. There are many different forms of collective action. Government is one of them. Civil society is another. Government has some unique properties that are absolutely essential. Government has the power to require everybody to contribute. And again, economic theory of the last 30 or 40 years has helped us understand why that's necessary. When there are public goods, there are problems of free riders. You can't solve problems of externalities and pollution by saying voluntarily stop polluting. Incentives without those kinds of restraints are always going to be to save money and to pollute, to put the rest of our society at risk from undertaking excessive risk-taking in certain forms like the banks did. So in one way or another, we need not just voluntary collective action, there are certain areas where we need, you might say, compulsory collective action. Now, the analytics arguments that I've given, I find compelling. And I have never heard a good answer from the conservatives on any of these arguments. And it's really quite striking. Today, the argument on the right, besides the religious people who say markets always work, in spite of the fact that you look at the world and you say they aren't working, those are people it's very hard to convince. The argument of those who want to engage in the subject in an intellectually honest way is, yes, there are market failures, but there are government failures. And that the government failures are so serious that they, in fact, not only don't resolve the market failures, they actually make things worse. They muck things up. And you see that, for instance, in the recent discussions of the economic crisis, the people on the right will claim it wasn't the market that failed. They put the blame on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Jeff organized, again for the Roosevelt Institute, a fantastic program down in Washington addressing that particular charge. Let me make it perfectly clear. At that point, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were private institutions. They've been privatized in 1968. So there was no way of saying that they were government institutions. But the Financial Inquiry Commission that looked at this issue and involved, it was a bipartisan, everybody except one came to the conclusion that while Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac may have had a little role, it was very little. It was basically a private sector failure. And when we look at that private sector failure and we calculate the cost of the economic crisis that, at least in large measure, has to be attributed to the misdeeds of the financial sector, we're talking about a loss of income and the misallocation of capital before the crisis and the underperformance of the economy after the crisis. We're talking about losses in the trillions of dollars. No government has ever wasted money, no democratic government has ever wasted money on the scale of that of our private sector. And we have to keep these perspective on these losses. Yes, no institution is ever perfectly efficient. But our choice, say in the case of responding to the crisis, is do we allow the massive waste of resources of having our underutilization of our people, of our capital, and the stress and the consequences that it has? Or do we stimulate the economy and try to get back to full employment? So the basic perspective that I want to put forward is that no human institution is perfect. Chair is human, and so there are going to be failures. But an appropriate way of thinking about it is to think about each of these, the private, public, civil society, as acting as a check on each other. A kind of idea that I think that, is analogous to that John Kenneth Galbraith put forward some 30, 40 years ago in his theory of countervailing powers. Now, a little bit more subtle than that, but still what we need is a greater balance. And what we need also to do to strive to improve the performance of both. One of the most interesting initiatives that I was involved in when I was in the White House was an initiative that has a little bit of the flavor of the title here. Rather than rediscovering government, we called it reinventing government. And our objective was to try to rediscover government, ask what it should be doing, but also how it could do what it did better. And I think we had a great deal of success. Well, looking at this analytic framework broadly, if we look more empirically, historically, what we see is that most successful countries, in most successful countries, government has done many of the, or most of the things that I've listed. Government has played a central part of their economy and of their society. And no country has succeeded without government doing most of the things that I've described. So, when we talk about this, I want to reiterate what I said before. We have to think very carefully about how we measure success. But when I made those assertions, it's even true in terms of the mismeasurement, in terms of the broader measure of GDP. But if we looked at it in terms of real standards of living, countries in which government has played a central part have done much, much better. An example, there are a whole set of metrics, examples. The UNDP calculates a human development indicator, HDI, and they've now also calculated a human development indicator, which adjusts for inequality. So it tries to look at what's happening to most citizens in terms of education, health, as well as income. And the United States does not rank very high. It ranks 23rd in that list. At the top of all of that list are, for the most part, the Scandinavian countries. The finance minister of one of those countries, I asked him, had a conversation where I asked him what was their reason for their success, and then he said, high taxes. Now that seems very incongruous to Americans who are told high taxes lead to the disaster or the destruction of any economy and any society. And then he went on to try to explain what he meant. Why is high taxes good? Why are high taxes good? And the answer was very, very simple. He said, look, if you're going to have a well-functioning economy, society, you have to pay for what you get. And you need to have a well-functioning society, a government that provides education, infrastructure, research, technology, all these things, and we have to pay for it. And as a result of paying for it, we have a high standard of living. And we have not only a high standard of living, we have high rates of growth in all the measures. They're doing much better than the United States in recent years. So the point of this is that high taxes, well designed, with money used well, do lead to better economic performance. Now, when I say this to some of my, people on the conservatives, they say, well, yes, Sweden is one thing, but America is another. But again, I think I've never been persuaded by that argument, and you look at the successes of the United States in research and in the past, and the way we performed in the decades after World War II, when we were brought together as a nation to fight that war. And you see that that period, 30 years, 25 years after World War II, was a period in which we grew much faster than we did in the period since 1980. And it was a period in which we grew together. And one of the reasons was, I would argue, the legacy of the Roosevelts. The legacy that government made a difference, and that and a view that was both in some sense at that time widely shared across our economy. Well, let me just conclude. I've been told I'm running out of time. 1 minute. I want to finally just mention 2 points very briefly. The kind of approach that I've talked about really reflects the perspectives of an economist, for which I have to apologize, especially since economics has had such a disastrous effect on our economy. Jeff is writing a book, I think, on that subject. And the reason why I emphasize that is that an essential part of economics is this view of what's sometimes called methodological individualism. It assumes that our preferences are given, are exogenous, that they just exist out of nowhere. Whereas in fact, the way we interact as a society shapes our society. Societies, one of the things that research in economics has shown that people who study economics wind up to be more selfish than people who don't study economics. And we've been shaping our society to create people who are more selfish. And all of us, when we raise our children, what do we think we're doing? We're trying to shape our children. They don't come fully formed with well-defined preferences in the way the economist is. And we spend a lot of energy trying to shape our children. But that's true of all of us as a society as well. And so that's why I began by saying this issue here that we're talking about is not just shaping our economy. What's at stake is shaping our society. And the final question I want to talk about, as part of that shaping, is there's a real debate, which will be one of the sessions later on today, about why the progressives have seem to have failed in this particular intellectual debate. The evidence, the theory, is overwhelming that there is a need for a strong government. There is no economic theory of, that sustains the position of the conservatives that unfettered markets work. Yes, there are the government failures, but we also know that governments, you look at historically and across countries, there are successes in government, and there's no reason that the United States can't be among those successes. If we were in that we had those successes in the past. So that raises a deeper question of why has there been this failure of public perception? And I just want to throw out one set of ideas, which is that one of the advances in social science research in recent years has been an understanding of understandings of behavioral economics and psychology. Those in the advertising industry know how to shape people's beliefs. They have to. They don't be wasting this money if they didn't get people to buy. Well, you can sell ideas just like you can sell products. And you can sell products that are bad for your health. We know that. Companies did a very good job, Marvel of Man. And you can sell bad ideas as well. So we have to understand a little bit better about marketing of ideas, how people form perceptions, and how to engage somewhat better in this debate, which is not only trying to understand what we need, why we need government, what government should be doing, but how do we convince more Americans that that is the case? Thank you.